Thank you guys for all attending our session here today.
Glad you found it in the basement.
We reserved only the finest
That's
room
right. Thanks.
for you. We reserved the room before we knew Bennett would be one of the stars of the keynote. And had we known that, we would have upgraded. We would have gotten a fern to go between us here on stage. So enough of the witty banter. My name is Dean Gonzalski. I'm with Relativity, the company formerly known as Kcura. And we'll walk through our agenda in a second, but the session today is entitled Lawyering in the Information Age. And really what we want to do today is we've got Bennett for a full hour. You got a snippet of him on stage earlier today, and this is the kind of extended dance mix version. We'll walk through the whistleblower case that he talked about briefly, and if we have time, we'll jump into a couple other interesting areas as well. Feel free to ask questions. It's rare to get Bennett here up on stage, and so we'll use our time wisely. So I'm Dean Gonzalski, as I said. I'm the VP of Marketing. I focus on our industry sectors, our corporate law firm and government sectors. At Relativity, I'm a recovering attorney by trade and been doing e-discovery for longer than I care to admit, forever, Bennett says, quietly. But Bennett, why don't you talk about your background? You mentioned a little bit earlier coming from sort of the investigative side and on the government, maybe sort of give folks a little information on how you got into the space and your career.
Sure. So I'm the chief data scientist at Drinker Biddle. I'm a partner in its litigation group and one of the chairs of what we call the Information Governance and e-discovery group. And the firm has a subsidiary that is a technological services subsidiary that I'm one of the co-CEOs of, if you can have two of those. And I come to the law through a very odd lens. I went to work at the CIA when I was like 22 years old, right when the idea of understanding human behavior by the digital trail we leave was just starting to take hold, because Al Gore invented the World Wide Web in 1989, and cell phones were just starting to appear in the early 90s. And so this idea of capturing a digital trail that people leave and what you could learn from that was just coming to the fore. So I was really kind of raised professionally in that environment. Decided to go to law school and did that after 7 or 8 years, and graduated in the early 2000s, right when the e-discovery world was really starting to come into play. And everybody knew the 2006 amendments were coming, but they weren't there yet, and what that meant. And so I came into the law at a very interesting place where getting at data was a critical skill, and it's one that I lucked into having. After working in that space forever, I was exposed to a lot of machine learning and analytics in my prior career, and brought that perspective into the law and was constantly kind of pushed into that area. And then there were so many advances in data science. I guess 3 or 4 years ago, I went and got a graduate degree in data analytics to kind of round out, because why not have another $200,000 worth of education debt, really?
In your spare time.
Right.
Okay. Well, as we said, very interesting perspective here today, melding sort of law and technology. From an agenda perspective, we're going to walk through this whistleblower case. I think there's some really interesting nuggets there. Hone in on some lessons learned, and if we have time, we've got kind of some bonus fact patterns to get into. And I think the theme today is going to be not only how to use technology, but also sort of the larger theme of how the practice of law is changing. And we were talking earlier about how necessary it is for attorneys in today's age to be able to be fluent and not necessarily sort of just resist the changes moving forward. So at a really high level, Bennett mentioned this in the keynote this morning. There was a whistleblower case, and I think there's probably a kind way to put it as we refer to the whistleblower as really sort of the extortionist, and how that was all resolved. And we'll walk through some of these facts here. But maybe as we start out, how common do you see this kind of scenario, right? This presents itself kind of unusually, but in reality, this could be abstracted into sort of an HR claim of almost any ilk, right?
And it's very, very common. The problem is we usually don't see it in litigation because the companies settle out, right? especially when you've got senior executives and people leaving a company involuntarily. There's very often allegations of discrimination or these kind of whistleblower claims. They happen very, very often. And usually it's not worth the trouble and expense of figuring out what happened to fight it. It's easier just to pay it off, right? And as with most things in my career in the law, that just offends me. Like, I don't like the fact that companies are settling cases or claims just because they don't feel like they can economically get at a right answer and prove it with certainty. And that's really the cool thing now, right? Is that with so much information that we leave behind as we do everything, the things, our logins, our key card swipes, all the emails we send, the systems we log into, the documents we create, we have so much information about where we are and what we're doing that it is very easy these days to figure out precisely what happened and why. And so that is really what this whole discussion is about, is this idea of lawyering in the information age, that being able to reach into data and find an answer quickly and with certainty just sets you apart completely as a lawyer. But more importantly, it's getting to the point where lawyers who can't do that simply don't have a space in the information age any longer.
And Bennett, so when you guys sort of saw this fact pattern emerge and the client contacted you, what would be the traditional old school way of doing this and investigating it, just to contrast it?
It's almost the opposite of the way we do it now. So if you think about, one, you decide whether you need to bring outside counsel in. So you call your counsel, they come in and they interview everybody, right? You sit down and you interview people. It takes weeks to get all that done. You get everybody's story, and then you think about pulling some documents and maybe looking at them. And the traditional way, how do you search for this? This allegation was over a year in the making, right? That the company, this guy said, the company has been doing this for at least a year. And how do you look for that, right? It was a very complicated accounting issue. Figuring out who would have been involved and what they said, and that's a lot of data. And so normally you would throw that at an army of either associates or contract attorneys who would churn out at their $50 an hour. And so, $200,000 later, you'd get a first pass review, and then all the lawyers would have to go through it. It would take you 3 or 4 months to get to what happened. And in this case, that couldn't happen. So we were literally 3 weeks away from a reporting period. The accountants were literally on site, about to wrap up their audit and issue financial statements. And they refused to do that. They wouldn't issue the financial statements without this issue being run to ground. And so normally, one, it would have just blown up the audit, right? They would have had to file late, and this would have had an effect on the street. It was a really, really big deal. But because the company just couldn't find an answer in the time frame that we needed to, they would have been in a pretty bad state.
So where did you guys start? We talked through in these slides in kind of a couple days, but what was day one? What was the activity for you guys?
So it's like we would do with any kind of e-discovery workflow, right? Is what e-discovery all about really is discovery, right? And we often get so caught up in where the documents are and getting to the documents fast, but that's really not the point. The point really is figuring out what happened and why. And so raising your vision to that area, right? So think like an investigator, think like a spy, an intelligence person, right? Think like a law enforcement officer where you're investigating wrongdoing. So the first thing we start is, okay, if what this guy said was true, what would that evidence look like and where would it be? And so we go looking for that, right? So this guy had some pretty detailed stuff. He said that he had reported this in a series of meetings with a compliance officer and gave the dates of these meetings. And so the first thing we did, of course, is we got all the data in our hands. And so we did what we call a 360 pull. And so we pulled his data, so email, we always start with email because email contains most of everything, right? The people he reported to, the people reported to him, and his peers. And so we ended up with about 12 or 15 people, and we pulled their entire email box for the period. We wanted all the data in our hands so we could slice and dice the data. And so once we had the data in our hands, it was like, all right, so how do you uncover this? It was kind of a specific accounting issue, so we had some pretty good terms, and usually you don't, but at least we could start to whittle down when conversations occurred. And our most important approach to this is we are pursuing lines of investigation, right? And so, when was the first meeting that this was mentioned at? What words did they use? Was there an agenda? Was there email follow-ups? Did any documents come out of the meeting? And every little bit that you find along the trail gives you more words and phrases. It gives you more people. Every clue kind of gives you more to go down those paths.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but he had manufactured some information as well, which probably made it a little
So
hard.
Normally these things are just easy as pie, right? You're following a line of investigation. The facts come out very quickly, who's involved, what they did, what decisions were made, where the documents were. And the story is very clear, right? This is actually a pretty easy thing to do. But we started getting conflicting evidence. And so what was so interesting about the timing of this, and the timing was really critical because his allegation was, you fired me because I raised this complaint. And so when he raised this complaint and when he got a bad employment evaluation, those two things were critically important. So the way things actually happened was in the spring, he got a needs improvement on his performance eval, which is like the worst you can get, right? And the way things work at that company, a year later, you get another one, you're out. 2 strikes and you're out, right? And he kind of knew the writing was on the wall, right? So this first thing had happened in March. He'd gotten his performance eval, and then he actually started raising this issue in May, right? Well, then for the next year, he laid this little trail of breadcrumbs, right? Saying, he had meetings with compliance people. He would raise this issue over and over again. And we saw emails from like July saying, I first told you in this meeting with what's-his-face on March, whatever it was. And we're like, but that meeting didn't happen in March. And he emailed the agenda from that meeting with the March date on it. And we're like, this doesn't make sense because we could see there's a calendar invite for May. The original agenda had May on it, and this one had March on it. And that's when we started to figure out there was something going on here.
Yeah, and so just looking at his email would have been confusing, to say the least.
And very absolutely supportive of his claim.
Right.
Like once we had an idea that he was potentially fabricating stuff, so then we went into the documents, we looked at metadata, when things were created and when they were edited. And there was these series of emails he sent every quarter to the compliance guy saying, these long emails, once again, the company is doing this thing wrong and saying all this stuff. Well, what was interesting is even looking at things like his draft folder, we kept seeing all these duplicates of these emails to this compliance guy. But they were different. Like some of using the near dupe analysis, which is something we do a lot, we found emails that were almost like the ones he sent, but the numbers that were in the reporting period were missing. And so we were able to figure out that he was falsifying his complaint. Like he was saying, the company did this, reported this, and they really should have reported that. And he had prepared that weeks before the numbers actually came out. Then the numbers would come out, he would plug them in and send an email off. And so I gave this guy a lot of props. Like this was a nicely laid, anybody else would have just paid the guy. I mean, it would have been a big problem.
And so instead of focusing on his improvement in the job, he created this elaborate trail. When we've got it up on the slide here, you also sort of diagnosed that he was in cahoots with his wife, I guess, as well?
Yeah, so some of these near dupes we found in emails from this innocuous Gmail address to him. When we put like our, hacker kids on figuring it out, and it turns out that this was a Gmail address of his wife, who is an employment attorney. And when we started investigating a little bit into what was in his cache and things that had been deleted, there's all these emails back and forth between her and him where he would log into his Gmail account. So these was emails back and forth between their Gmail account, but we had some of that stuff in internet cache where she's coaching him on how to design a whistleblower claim, basically. So anytime you log into, like if I go to gmail.com and log into my email account and open up an email, that email exists on my computer in my internet cache. And so it depends on the settings, it depends if you clear cache, and so sometimes you find this stuff, sometimes you don't. And other emails he had deleted from his email account, but we had those in an archive. Others were on his deleted space, the Slack space on his hard drive. So once we knew that there was stuff here that was deleted and manufactured, we went pretty hardcore press looking for that stuff.
And so I'm guessing you were able to do a forensic image of his laptop. Okay.
Yes.
Is that usual course
No,
and speed for you guys?
not at all. 99% of the time, we never get past email because you can figure out what happened and why from email. But, documents that aren't emailed around either are in a database or they're too big and they're referenced or linked somewhere and you can go find those docs. Non-email ESI in 90% of the cases just doesn't matter.
Right, but because he fabricated his, he had to dive deeper. Let's talk about the timeline a little bit. I mean, this was all moving really aggressively. Is this on the order of weeks, days, hours?
Days. This is so, we've got a fact development team that we've put together over the last 15 years. And these are all very experienced data investigators. Some of them are computer scientists and data scientists. And so we have the ability to get through data extremely quickly. And so we had 1 million emails that we pulled. We had that entire email set completely vetted, found everything to do with this issue over a year in less than 3 days. And so we knew everything about this guy. Every meeting he had, everything he said. We had even unraveled the fact that he had manufactured this evidence on the third day. And so we moved very quickly on this. And this is the real power behind this. If you can figure out how to get answers out of data quickly, that is the most valuable skill that you can have as an attorney. A certainty of position, even if your position is bad, right? Companies, they frankly, they care, but it doesn't really matter whether they did it or they didn't do it. They just want to know one way or the other so they can move forward, right? And so getting at answers with certainty, which is much easier to do in the electronic age, is really what this is all about. And so being able to go to the board within 3 days and present all of this evidence and say, we are certain that what he said isn't true, that's amazingly powerful.
And I've got to imagine there was a certain glee of sort of when you meet with the client and show them, they've got the good facts, and then being able to present them to the opposition and show this whistleblower the classic, you slide the paper across the desk sort of thing.
It is. And it's my favorite part of the job. One is being able to go to a company and say, here's exactly what happened. And we've done this literally dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And leaders of companies, their biggest fear is the unknown. And not knowing what happened, not knowing what's going to uncover, not knowing what it's going to mean for the company. But if you can give them facts, provable facts, it's just that sense of security is something that is incredibly valuable to them. And we've worked with this company a lot. We do all of their investigation work, we do all of their discovery work because of this. And so that's always a great feeling. But my favorite thing was dealing with this guy's attorney, who was aggressive and foot stompy and typical kind of opposing attorney who thinks he's got a good case. And so I got to sit down and meet with him and just say, look, this case just needs to go away because you're going to lose. And of course, they think that's all posturing, right? They're like, you're not going to, like all I do. And so I'm like, well, watch. And then click, walking him through this PowerPoint of all this evidence. And my favorite part is watching their faces. As you watch this ashen, kind of pallor come over them as they realize that not only do they not have a case, but their clients have been lying to them the whole time. And so
the contingency fees
right.
going quickly out the window.
Right.
What was the demand originally?
Well north of the high 6 figures into 7 figures.
Okay.
And that was just on his severance and claim discrimination and retaliation and stuff like that. And so to watch that disappear was nice, but frankly, that wasn't our biggest problem.
Right, so in terms of that disappearing, that it almost go away sort of right after the PowerPoint?
Yeah, so we literally got a call the next morning saying the guy had dropped the case.
Gotcha, okay.
And he never filed a complaint, right? All he sent was a demand letter,
Okay.
right? And that was an important point here because if you can head this stuff off before it hits, because once a complaint's filed, it takes a lot to run these guys off of a complaint. And so acting really quickly, even when you get demand letters, especially in the employment setting, that happens a lot. You'll get a demand letter, or like in the IP world, you'll get some areas of law. You'll often get a demand letter before you get a complaint, because a complaint's a lot of work. So especially in these contingency cases, they don't want to spend a lot of money. So if you can act quickly in the demand letter state, and so it stopped this case from even being filed.
Gotcha. So game over almost.
Yes.
So walk us through sort of the next piece of the story.
Well, this was harder, right? Because you had, one of the big four accounting firms. This is a big, big public company. I'm going to say this humbly somehow. So this auditing firm came and said, look, this is a big deal. If it's true, not only do we have problems for this reporting period, but potentially restatement. I mean, it was a catastrophic problem. And it was and this guy was a very senior executive, right? And so they have to take the allegation seriously, and the accounting firm wanted to do their own investigation. And so, but when the company said that we were doing the investigation, and this was one of frankly, the proudest moments of my career, when that company said, oh, if Bennett's doing the investigation, we'll waive his results. And that, honestly, after years of working in this industry, that was one of the best things that ever happened to me. And so we did this investigation, presented a full report to the auditor, and they accepted our results. But this was much harder, right? Because I was just, with the worst guy, we were just trying to figure out, did this happen or did it not? Right? Just the timing. Now we had to actually prove that the accounting was correct. I'm a lot of things, but I ain't an accountant, right? And this was a complicated issue. And so we had to derive all the accounting evidence and make sure what was reported was accurate. And so again, we had to dip into all these emails to see how this particular thing was accounted for and reported up, and then it got on the books correctly. And that we could hand to the auditors, and they could look at it and say, okay, here's how the numbers were derived, they were reported correctly, and the accounting was correct. And all of that happened. We were able to hand that to them 3 days after.
So that sounds like a very different sort of tool set and sort of process that you guys went about. And we're obviously interested in some of the tools that you used. Did you use different methods to try to uncover the audit data? We
did, because unlike so following this guy when he got kind of put on probation and all his meetings and the stuff, that's one whole flow, right? You're kind of following a trail over time. But then we had to reconstruct how this accounting was done. Like, where did the numbers come from? Who reported them? How did those get aggregated up and put into the ledger? How did those get reported out? And that's a whole other work stream, right? And so it involved a whole different set of people and stuff that, frankly, I didn't understand very well. So now we've got a fact development team who is finding stuff that we think matters, but much more closely working with the accounting group and the client and things like that, and with the auditor to figure out what audit evidence would be sufficient for them to be able to pass the audit.
Gotcha. And in terms of like analytics, we're using any visualization or using RAR? What kind of tools were you using in this latter phase?
This is, and we do this every review we do with Relativity is this way. And so when we start to go after the data, first we decide whether it's accessible by words well or not, right? This one was pretty good. Search terms were pretty good because it was a very specific accounting issue, and there was a couple of words that worked well. That's true of like a product liability case where you've got an opposing party or you've got a product, right? That doesn't work so well when you're in things like discrimination or complaints, right? What are you gonna look for? I'm discriminating against you, right? The people don't use those words. And so we've developed a lot of things to catch those stuff, but some things are not, they aren't amenable to words. And so once we start to find a trail, we usually know people say this happened around this time. And so we use the people and the time aspect of the data to start to find stuff. And once you find stuff, you can start loading in the words and phrases people are using, kind of the social network side of it. And so the relativity analytics that we rely a lot on are the clustering and the keyword kind of the synonymy work, the structured analytics that tell us who's talking to who when. And so we look for anomalies of communication patterns, like when people are talking to each other. Is it during or after work hours? Is it on the weekends? Are there anomalies in that data? We look for forwards to personal email accounts and BCCs. We have a whole thing we call the dirty word list, right? Where we look for profanity, because when people swear, it's either something really good or really bad that happened, right? And so you can start to hone in on where these things are happening. And you got to look across what's normal for that, because there's some, like financial services, they are the most swearing people on the planet. It's like the Navy, dude. They're like, and so you've got to find your baseline, but you're always looking for these anomalies and out of pattern stuff. And so when we start to find, like, we love the clustering work in relativity, because once we start to find a whole bunch of stuff, we go back and look at what cluster groups that's in. And so and we look at the rest of the stuff in that cluster, because words are never going to get you all the way there. And so we're constantly looking, we find paths which carve like holes in your data set. And so you're left with this kind of Swiss cheese thing. But the analytics and the RAR, which we use quite often as well, it expands what you're searching for into these other areas.
You saw in the keynote and probably heard about this before, obviously, with the continuous active learning. Like, how you see that playing into your workflow? Are you already using kind of continuous active learning technology?
Yeah, so we just rolled this out. So we're just testing, we call it Cal. We even have his little picture with sunglasses, like Cal. And the nice thing about active learning is that what we're doing is using our own investigative techniques and using the analytics that are there to slice and dice the data. The nice thing about active learning is that every decision we make gets amplified across the data set. And so it has the potential of drastically increasing my capacity to get at data quicker. And that's really what we need. I mean, we passed the 50 million documents reviewed mark this year, so far this year with you guys. And that's just a whole lot of stuff to look at. And so anything that I can do that increases my ability to get at and exclude stuff, as well as include stuff, is just going to be good for us.
And I think probably important for folks who are in the business, right? You're talking about a relatively small team,
yeah.
Right? So maybe just give folks a little bit about Tritura and how that's structured, because you're not doing this with an army of people.
No, this fact development team is 7 people. And so we can review 1 million documents a week with 7 people. And so because of the way that we address the data and the analytics that we use, we are big users of sampling data sets, and like we'll craft a set of terms and figure out where it's wrong, and craft a whole set of not terms and sample that and figure out if we're still including stuff that shouldn't be in the not set. We figure out why and recraft our terms, and we're certainly using all these tricks about the social networking, who's talking to who when, and the dirty word list. We have a fraud word list. But we've built things like sentiment analysis, which is highly predictive of relevant information. So we pipe out the metadata and text from Relativity. We've got a whole set of home-built algorithms and analytics that we use that create all different kind of feature flags that we throw back into Rel. That we can pivot on. And so it's kind of a mixture of our little Frankenstein monster, where Rel is the core of it, that we have all these algorithms we've built that we throw flags and facets back in.
Gotcha. Let's wrap up on this one, and I think as we get to takeaways here in a second, we'll see if we can get into an additional fact pattern. But I mean, this is interesting, right? This was somebody was pretty creative, and even if you wouldn't have ultimately prevailed, probably would have cost the company a lot of money just to prove that that the company was righteous to begin with, and could have been, ultimately millions of dollars with refilings and all these other things.
And what do you do with conflicting information, right? How do you know which one's right without really proving which version of the world was correct? Usually the company's going to pay at that point, because they don't want the risk of being wrong.
Right. So how would you sort of wrap up kind of the big picture from this case, and then we'll segue into a few others?
So we have to start thinking like investigators. I loved Andrew's word this morning, interrogators, right? That we are interrogating the data. One is understanding that as people walk through the world, they leave a trail behind. And that trail puts them at a place, at a time, doing a thing. That's a fact, right? And if you have enough of those facts put together, you can tell a story about what happened and why. And if you think more like an investigator and less like an e-discovery person, we often in e-discovery, we think, all right, here's a complaint, I'm gonna analyze the complaint, here's my custodians, here's my data sources, I'm gonna go collect, I'm gonna throw it at a tool, throw 50 people at it, and they're gonna review all the documents and code them and hand them off to Merits Council and we're done, whew, right? That's great, but we focus too much on that process and not the outcome. The outcome is the facts. And the facts are what drive everything. And so the two biggest inefficiencies in e-discovery, one is the review process itself, but the second is the what I call the knowledge transfer piece. The people who do the doc review, they know more about anybody else about that case. And how do you transfer that knowledge into the heads of the decision makers on the merit side? Yeah. And so we've done a lot at our group about how to make that transfer more seamless. How we're granulating the data and how we're serving it up. And when we do a review, we even write up what we call we literally write a report, and we rely a lot on Fact Manager. And so we identify these facts, we link to the documents, and we basically write a report and say, here's your case. Here's the subjects, here's all the key documents, here's the narrative that fits the documents together, go prove your case.
And how much sort of evangelism do you need to do with the attorneys in your firm who might not be as fluent with these kind of approaches?
Early on, a lot. Only because I learned how to describe what I do differently. Like I don't talk analytics, because as soon as you start to say the word data, the most lawyers are like, they don't get it. And lawyers don't like not getting things, and so they're resistant to things they don't get. And so I started talking about, I can tell you what happened with certainty and quickly. And that perks up their ears, right? That's interesting to them. And the cool thing about this is, so once we've done this a couple of times for a couple of clients, now I can barely keep up with the amount of work that we have. We're doing 10 and 12 reviews simultaneously with this team of 7 people. We've had to employ more and more analytics, and we have what we call the expansion pack for our review team that are because once you get down and slice and dice, you still have a pile of docs that somebody's got to look at, right? And that's a more linear, and I can push that to my less ninja folk, right? And
maybe you should tell the crowd what expansion pack means.
So we have the ninja squad, right? So the fact development team, and then we have a group of regular humans who we use more like on linear review like you would on contract review. And we call them the expansion pack. So when we need to flex our capacity, we go to that group of people where they don't have to be such whizzes with analytics and things. They can just be really clever and very efficient doc reviewers.
Gotcha. How do you see all this sort of impacting sort of drinker and the practice of law? Like it's coming pretty quickly. Where do you see your firm and Tritura in the next couple of years?
Well, this is what's really fun for me, because once you realize what your skill set is, and that's finding answers in data, that's what all of us do fundamentally, that has an impact upon every area of law. I don't care what you do. And so Jay Bruds and I, who are the chairs of this group, we went around to every practice group in the firm and said, look, I've got this thing I can do. I can find any answer that you want to find. And so how would that help you? Like what do you commonly face in your practice group where you would love to know more certain answers? And the first group that really bit on that was the mergers and acquisitions group. Because if you think about it, the price that you set for a company you're acquiring is based upon their value plus or minus based on the level of certainty about the value and the risk, right? So the more you know about their value and the more you know about the risk that they might carry, the better, more efficient the market's going to be, right? And markets run on information. And so we redesigned the whole due diligence process, right? So that we're asking, because due diligence is basically a game of go fish, right? Just like discovery is. Give me all your documents about this. Give me all your AR. Give me all your customer whatever. Give me your employment risk. Give me your environmental risk. And we've been able to help them do that much better, right? So that we're getting clear answers on what's going on. Even on the post-acquisition side, so every time you buy a company, the company you're buying makes these representations. They say, I'm giving you information that is correct. It's based on generally accepted accounting principles. I have a reasonable basis for what I'm telling you. And if I happen to be wrong, we've set aside 10% of the purchase price in an indemnification fund, and you get some money back for me lying to you, right? The problem is, and that's in every deal, but no one ever acted on those indemnification provisions because they usually have a really short window, 90 days, 180 days, and usually companies don't figure out that the information was wrong in that amount of time. So we've developed a whole business where as soon as we buy another company, the first thing we do, once you own their assets, you own their information assets, right? And so we sweep in, and if there's an area that we're concerned about, we basically do an investigation into that space and know exactly what the risk is or what the problem might be or if what they told you is correct or not. And have gotten millions and millions of dollars back in these indemnification claims. And the cool thing is, the claim is nothing but cut and paste from emails from their CEO and their outside auditor and their deal counsel, because the privilege goes with the company, right? And so we've done this with bankruptcy group, with our healthcare group. And so once you start to realize that really what we do is we get answers out of data, you can start applying that in a myriad of ways outside of just litigation and regulatory investigations.
And I'd imagine this is looking sort of retroactively. You can start to do things more in real time and maybe proactively, right?
Yeah, and this is one of my favorite things that we worked on, because all of us in litigation, we go clean up a problem, right? So some problem has happened and we go clean it up. And so we're always looking back in time to figure out who did what, right? So we are describing the past. So all of our analytics that we use are what they call descriptive analytics, right? We're describing something that already happened. And yet in the data science world, there are giant industries, and almost every company now uses predictive analytics, right? So we've gotten extremely good at figuring out what price somebody's going to buy something at, if they're going to respond to an ad, if they're, what hotel rooms or cars or shoes they're going to buy. We can predict human conduct with an immense degree of precision. And so, as I said this morning, if we can predict conduct, why can't we predict misconduct? All it requires is enough examples, right? I know that Dean's going to buy a Hershey bar at 3 o'clock every afternoon because he's done it every day, and everybody else in his building does the same thing, right? I mean, you get enough examples of people doing a thing, you can build a model off of it, right? Well, we in this room have thousands and thousands and thousands of examples of data sets where bad guys have done bad stuff. And we've coded it all as responsive or not, or relevant or not, right? So we have positive examples of bad guys doing bad stuff, and we have negative examples. That's all you need to build a model. So we took these hundreds of data sets that we have of past litigation and investigations and built models. Can you predict when someone's going to do something bad? Because if I can predict it, I can prevent it, and that has tremendous value. And so we built this. This was part of my graduate work, and now I've carried it on into our firm, obviously. And it raises really interesting questions. It's very accurate. We have this Project Zoltar is what we call it, because they won't let me call it Minority Report. But it raises very interesting ethical questions, which is where analytics comes in, right? Is just because I have a 99% probability that somebody's going to do something bad, do I act? Do I wait for them to act? What are the ethics of that? Do I wait for them to cause harm? How much harm? Then am I then responsible because I knew they were going to commit harm? It starts to get into very interesting areas that we as lawyers have both the ability and responsibility to look into.
So is this the Zoltar?
Zoltar.
Yeah. Are you selling that service yet, or is it still more theoretical?
We are. This is where it gets really top secret because most companies don't want people to think that they're being monitored. But some people have to, like the financial services industry, they're required to monitor their people. Companies that have gotten into trouble with regulators and have a consent decree that they're going to monitor this or that, right? But the cool thing about these systems is it monitors a bunch of stuff, and can anyway. Like because it's based, a large part of it is based on sentiment analysis. We can actually watch the happiness or satisfaction level of a workforce. And it's very interesting and so just for retention purposes, right? I mean, employee, not doc retention. Watching problems start to arise in a division and somewhere and then being able to intercede and prevent people from fleeing, that's cool. And so this is what I love is the insights that we've been able to develop about human behavior and from the data we have access to allows us to be very different kinds of counselors in the information age.
That sounds like a good place to kind of pause, let the audience absorb, and see if you guys have any questions for Bennett, both about methodologies. We could literally do this all day, so we want to make sure we're respectful of time. Yes, go ahead.
I had two different areas of questions. The first is, I'm really impressed by how quickly you were able to get the data up and make it reviewable. So I'm wondering, did you use relativity collections and processing, or how did you approach that?
So we have. So in this case, we didn't. Because we have a very long-term relationship with this client, we have folks embedded with them. We've got, we know all their IT people. So when I say, hey, I need the emails boxes of these 4 people from this period of time, I can get that in 24 hours. And so, but very often with our clients, like I love Collection, which I call Scout, which is the coolest name ever, and I don't know why they don't use it anymore. This is awesome, like being able to download a thing, get on a WebEx, look at somebody's data, especially for targeted non-email ESI, it's awesome, right? Completely defensible, I can wrap it up somewhere, pull it over the wire, get it on a drive, send it to me. I love the whole collection thing. So for this case, we didn't, just because of the relationship I have with the client, but getting the data quickly does matter.
The other question I had was, did anybody do anything about the bad actor's wife?
You know, we talked a lot about that and decided not to. The evidence was, it wasn't like she was saying, here's how you falsify stuff, but here's the basis of a claim, here's, right? And so we felt, I knew what was going on, but we felt like we would let karma take care of that one, which it often does.
Yeah, in the back.
When you do the investigative work and then discovery comes in, can you marry them up?
Absolutely, we almost always do. And this gets really tricky, right? So you want to get ahead of the data, but there's challenges in getting too far ahead of the data, especially pre-litigation. Like we're in a case right now where big $500 million case, the parties were trying to negotiate a resolution. And so we did a whole e-discovery process where to figure out the strength of our position, to try to give evidence to get them to cave on some things, right? So we pulled like 50 people's emails over a 4-year period. We had everything completely, we knew everything that had happened, right? And then the negotiations fell down, both parties sued each other. And the nice thing was, this was beautiful. We were just beating the crap out of the other side because we had such mastery of the facts. We got an expedited schedule and they were just scrambling. We were so ahead of the facts, but my normal processes started to get affected because we had a 4-month period from the time I collected to the time the case started. So I had to do a true up, right? Because you always, when their doc requests come in, they say up to the present. They were never going to negotiate 4 months before the case. So I had to do a true up. There were interesting issues about the custodians I chose to do a pre-litigation investigation on compared to those who I wanted to be in the litigation and why, right? That got dicey. And so you have to be careful, like to marry your investigation and litigation strategies, but having the mastery of the facts going in is phenomenal. Like the other side just takes so long to catch up that you're have mastery over that case. And with regulators too, being able to prove to a regulator that you found the right answer and to waive off their investigations, that mastery of the facts is, so I really encourage even pre-litigation investigations. You just have to be aware of what implications that has on the discovery strategy.
Yes.
You talked about exporting your data to do additional analysis and some of the things you've developed. In your, scope of investigation, what percentage of the tools would you say are relativity-based versus things you've developed?
Probably 80% is rel, right? So especially lately. So relativity has really come a long way with the analytics that they have. So RAR is one, but even things like the concept clustering and the keyword synonymy kind of suggestions, the social networking aspects of it, most of my work we do in rel. It's for the more complicated cases where we just export the metadata and the text to run our algorithms on and then throw flags back into rel. But that's blindingly easy. One of the greatest things about relativity is that ability. That's why so many companies have APIs in and out of rel. But you could do any of this except the sentiment analysis with relativity.
Yeah.
I was curious, you mentioned that for the personal emails that you basically were pulling them from temp files or cache or whatever. I was curious what the format of those ends up being like. Is it text quality enough for things like writing, or is it just
No, they're horrible. They're fragmented pieces of junk. And so luckily we almost never have to go into that data. I think 1 out of 100 times I go into that kind of data. Amazingly though, as you guys know, people they forward their email to their work accounts, their home accounts. There's unbelievable amounts of stuff just in the data that you have easy access to. If I'm going to Slack space, it's usually because I've got a very clever bad actor who has deleted stuff or things like that. And that data is always completely junky. You're really into the forensic, hacker kids putting stuff back together. That's a complicated environment.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're often beholden to the data, and so I'm interested in how you took the conflicting evidence and you were able to garner that information. I understand you have your due dates, things along those lines, but at what point do you step back and make that determination?
So the nice thing is, it's rare that you have to go down to that level, right? Because usually you don't have conflicting stuff other than two people went to a meeting and came out of the meeting and said different things about it, right? People lie, right? You can't do much about that. But when it comes to data, the nice thing, especially in the last 5 years, you've got so much metadata around information now, and so many versions of documents are either logged in and out of a system. They're even on Windows servers, you've got last access dates and you've got all kinds of log information in the back. And so you can really easily tell with the right people looking at the data, the life history of a piece of information. We had a case really recently where it hinged on a press release of a public company, and they said something that the SEC had issues with. And depending on who said it at the company, they were liable or they weren't. If it was a control group person, they were liable. If it was some marketing guy, it wasn't. And so it became critical who put this sentence in and when, and based on what information. And so they didn't have a versioning, they didn't have a doc management system, and so we had to go back and reconstruct the life of this document as it got bounced around through emails and checked in and out of this one place where they had the document. And so when you have to recreate the life of that document, it's rare, but it's really quite easy to do now.
Gotcha. Any last questions? To go over here.
I'm really interested about the fabrication of this evidence, right? It sounds like he got caught because he wasn't as skillful as he thought he was. If someone had a higher degree of skills in fabricating evidence, how hard is it going to be going forward to pick this up?
Very. The nice thing is no one person at a company usually has sufficient control over its systems to completely control the creation of information. And so that's nice. So a company of any size, it's really hard for one evildoer to do evil. A conspiracy of evildoers, that's easier, that's easier for them to do and harder for us to pick up. The nice thing is even these predictive algorithms we have, the predictive compliance modules, it's really interesting the psychology of bad guys, because most of what our algorithms hit on are not the words and phrases people use and the way we think about it. It's actually the psychological behavior that they exhibit in their communications. And so we tested this on lots of systems where you have a bad guy who's lying and fabricating stuff and falsifying reports. But what's really interesting about the detection of that is what psychological profile they exhibit leading up to the time they decide to do something bad. And that people can't fake. It's really quite scarily accurate.
Well, I think to side with you, the more technology grows, the more IoT continues to mature, the harder it is for the most experienced hacker to get around this stuff. You just can't get around a cell phone tower picking up your location.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting. So depending on the activity, it's very hard to mask completely what you're doing. But also, nothing you can do is going to necessarily prevent an intent evildoer, right? And so you have to model your systems around what is reasonable conduct, right? And then have a way to detect faster.
Okay. Thank you guys for attending here today. Please let us know how we did, and thank you, Bennett, for your time.
Thanks very much.